You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. How about you?
Good. Got two news items for us today.
Ooh.
So the first one is the DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, says the U.S. is on heightened alert for Russian cyber attacks. So today is the 26th of January, right? That we're pre-recording this episode. So by the time it airs, I mean, some of these cyber attacks may have launched, or it might be a
Or never happened.
or never happened. Either way, we'll find out. But it's interesting. I mean, I saw this come up on a television news show, and the anchor said something to his guests like, "Oh, these cyber attacks have really dropped off recently." And I think it's like they're not as much in the news, but they're happening, right? I mean, all you have to do is, I mean, if you follow that area closely like we do, they're still happening on American businesses or businesses around the world, really, especially from ransomware types of organizations. I think this is talking more directly about state-sponsored attack on U.S. government agencies, which is, you know, obviously the most serious type.
Yeah, okay, so I feel like we're always under attack about something. So what else is new? We've gotten desensitized to the fact that everyone is getting hacked all the time, breaches, etc. So what's the second piece?
Yeah, the second piece is much more important, which is this draw to subscribe to Paramount Plus streaming service. I mean, their content is getting so good, but what I realized is that they have a Captain Picard movie coming out, and the basis of the storyline is it's, 14 years after he retired, he's living back on Earth, and he's running a Chateau Picard, which is basically a vineyard. He's, enjoying his retirement years, and someone shows up to get pulled back in to the Starfleet. So very, very drawn to. I have to see that movie. I was a Star Trek Next Gen kind of nerd.
Yeah, I was Star Trek Next Gen too. I'll watch pretty much anything for sci-fi. So I have Paramount Plus, and I'll be honest, I haven't even watched it yet. It came free with one of my cell phone things or something like that. So yeah, I mean, who doesn't like Star Trek? I mean, Jean-Luc Picard, Captain Kirk, Spock. Come on, it's a great universe. So I don't know. I don't think people are tuning into us though for our Paramount Plus critiques or Gene Roddenberry hot takes on Star Trek. So maybe we should talk a little bit about identity. Maybe there's some way as part of our conversation we can kind of tie it back. What do you think, Jim?
Make it so, number one.
Good one. All right. All right. So today, for a kind of a main overarching topic, what we're going to talk about is consumer identity and access management. It's pronounced CIAM sometimes, or CIAM, a bunch of different ways. But really what I want to focus on is really what does that mean from a authentication and an authorization perspective. And joining us live all the way from Belgium is Mr. Ward Duchamps. He's the CEO at Scaled Access. Hopefully I did not butcher your last name. And welcome to the show, Ward.
My pleasure to be here. And you did a good job pronouncing my name.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that it's probably late in the day for you, or maybe even, late in the evening, I guess at this point as a recording. So thank you so much for taking the time with us. This is the first time you've been with us on the show. And I think one of the things that we like to do is kind of find out what is the identity background for the people we have on, and kind of help people understand kind of the perspective and the context that you're approaching it with. So I'm going to ask you, my famous question is, how did you get into identity and access management? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Definitely the second. It chose me. But it's a story that already started like 2 decades ago, when I was part of a large consulting firm leading the security and privacy practice in Belgium. And we were engaged by the government to do projects in citizen identity. And that's actually this was one of the first identity projects that we got involved in, and later on authorizations also became a topic, mainly authorizations in ERP systems and role-based access controls and stuff that we'll talk about a little bit later on.
And you, I think, did some consulting in the background too, kind of way back in the day. I'm always curious, is like when, all right, so Jim and I are consultants in the identity space, and I guess the question is, when did you stop thinking about things and pivot into, hey, let's start actually solving some of these problems in the real world? What was that transition like?
It started off with a very personal frustration, actually. Going back to the same customers after a year after that you did a consulting job, you actually saw that nobody was able to implement the architecture that you've put in place. And then on top of that, customers actually started to ask us to do implementations as well. And that's when we switched jobs and from a consultant / architect into the system integration role. And back then, the domain where there was the biggest room for improvement was in consumer identity. And so we started implementing CIAM solutions for media companies and basically and entertainment companies, and basically the typical type of use cases where you've got the high volume, low value transactions.
So you went from consulting to implementation, and now you're with scaled access. I guess for people who aren't familiar with scaled access, we don't want to turn this into an infomercial, all about scaled access, but can you give us kind of like the elevator 30-second, what does scaled access do, and help bring us up to speed?
Absolutely. So scaled access is a SaaS-based authorizations platform. So we categorize in the group of externalized authorization management platforms. And so we manage authorizations based on relationships between users and groups and things in the industry. Pivoting from an SI to a product vendor was also triggered by the market, actually, because there was insufficient technology to deal with authorizations for consumers or for users that are typically live outside of the boundaries of an enterprise.
So in my experience, you focus in on that term authorization, which in my experience is the harder thing to solve than authentication. But, one of the things we like to do on the podcast is make sure we don't blow people away and leave them in the dust with some concepts that they might not already have a foundation in. So we talk about authentication, we talk about authorization. Give us the IAM 101. What's the difference between the two?
Both are a process in the user journey. And the authentication process returns the proof that the user is who he claims to be. And that is, for me, a very important sentence. It's about delivering proof that the identity is who he claims to be. And once that he delivered that proof to the machine, to an application, the next question in the journey is, what is this user allowed to do? And that is covered by authorization. And since that there is a notion of an authorization granted, what is the user allowed to do, there's always a kind of a rule or a business logic that determines what the user is allowed to do. And so this second thing is what I would call authorizations.
Yeah, I think that's an important concept. One of the ways that I always try to describe it to people is authentication is like the key to the front door. Authorization is which rooms in the house do you have access to. So I think that's kind of, I always try and dumb things down to the level that if I explained it to my dad, he would understand it. He's, he just got on email a couple of years ago. So now it's like he emails me all the time. I'm like, yeah, Dad, people don't do that for communicating with family anymore. But, hey, we love our parents. So the industry is really focused or centered on a couple of protocols, which take on authentication, but also authorization. So, I'm thinking about SAML. I'm thinking about OpenID Connect, which is built on the OAuth 2 framework. Can you give us a little background on these two major protocol stacks and what advantages or disadvantages they may have? Background being, as much as you can in terms of, kind of what problem they were created to solve, But then in terms of okay, where do they stand in terms of solving this authorization problem and the pros and cons of each?
Jim, I'm totally with you. The best way to understand a protocol or a standard is to go back to the initial use cases. What did they try to resolve when the standard was drafted? And so in that timeline, there was first a thing called SAML, and it originates basically from a company called Boeing, the manufacturer of airplanes. And Boeing wanted to have a mechanism to give suppliers access to repair manuals and other digital artifacts. And they didn't want to carry the burden of managing all these identities of these different suppliers and partners. So they started to build the concept of a federated identity. Boeing being the central instance to manage the data, and the partners being the central instance to manage the identity. And Boeing would trust the management processes of this partner. And that was basically the birth of the SAML protocol. It already gives a number of prerequisites. It requires that both parties that are part of such a federation have a very mature IT infrastructure, that are able to set up a pretty complex XML-based integration between two different identity systems. And then a couple of years later on, basically under the impulse of Yahoo, Google, Microsoft, so the nascent cloud providers, they started to build an alternative which was lightweight, built to be used on the internet. And that's actually the roots for OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect is all about it's similar mechanism. You've got one entity managing the identity, one entity managing a digital service, and you basically connect both, and you build a trust relationship between both. The big difference is that the OpenID Connect is built for scale, so it's much easier to set up. It's an open standard, and theoretically you can connect an infinite number of identity providers to your federation. And that's for me a big difference between SAML and OpenID Connect, because SAML has been built for a handful number of federations, basically.
Oh, that's a great overview. Thank you. I'm wondering, do you feel like where we stand currently? It's interesting. I saw news today about cookies, and now Google has set up a alternative to cookies called Topics, right? And the whole idea is that the privacy landscape is changing. We've already seen how it's like now everybody needs to accept cookies on almost every website you go to. But the idea is that people don't want to be tracked. And so the idea now with Topics is that you can be identified as a class of, you fit into a bucket, right? So individually, we don't need to know that Jim McDonald likes to go shopping for flannel shirts. He just could be, a men's apparel. He's interested in the men's apparel topic. The reason I'm bringing that up is it's a shift that is happening that's now changing a fundamental way that identification has happened on the web. I'm wondering, do you see any shifts in the landscape that could do the same thing with some of these authentication protocols? And really, so in other words, is there a need for new standards going forward, or do we have what we need? I know there are some fledgling standards that are coming up. Maybe you could talk about those and talk about kind of where you see those fitting in from a use case perspective.
There is definitely a need for new standards. So what we currently have with OAuth 2.1 and the follow-ups on that is very good, and is definitely a very valuable fundament to build new standards on top of. But I do expect a lot of innovation from the initiatives on distributed identity, DID, as well as on verifiable credentials, because the verifiable credentials is actually very much linked to what you refer to the topics. So you, as a user, you even do not present your identifier anymore, but you present a credential that says something about you. like I'm plus 18, and the only thing that I present to a digital service is that I'm vouched as being plus 18. So somebody else vouched that I'm indeed a plus 18 person, plus 18 years. And so that's definitely a way to protect privacy on the internet in the years coming on. And so verifiable credentials is, from my point of view, a very important standard that will support it. And topics is more like the vendor specific implementation of certain things, I would say.
How much should the user be in control of this versus, either the company or the vendor? Because I see this conflict between, I want to collect all this data, who manages it, right? And I think that's really the crux of the privacy conversation is how much am I willing to share? And I know we've got things out there like the UMA standard or UMA. We've had Eve on the show before. There's things like FHIR. And what I've seen recently is this mix of products, right? There's products out there that are designed to allow the user to manage what relationships or data they want to share, whether it's decentralized or whatever it may be. Or it might be built into a CIAM platform that gives some level of being able to manage those same pieces of information. I'm curious, where do you see things like UMA coming in, or FHIR? Maybe let's start with, what is FHIR? Because I believe it's a health record kind of approach. But does that make sense? From where I guess things are going today, and where should it go in your perspective in the future?
Yeah, UMA, to put it very short, is an extension on OAuth that can deal with error conditions. So whenever you're in an OAuth authorization flow, whenever a user asks for a certain authorization and the platform says, you're not allowed, UMA makes sure that you can do something with that not allowed, for instance, to redirect the question to another user. And that mechanism is actually used to build consents from given between one user and another user, which is from a use case point of view very valuable and definitely something that we need. My point of view on UMA is that the way how the protocol is formulated today adds a lot of latency in the communication. And so, for instance, in media sector, implementing UMA would be very, very hard to convince the business from, because UMA adds latency in the user journey, and media is very, very averse for user latency. So the ideas of UMA are great. My personal point of view, the adoption by the developer community is fairly low, latency being one of the arguments. The only place where I see UMA well adopted is indeed what you've referred to is the health sector, because there is another standard that is popping up, which is the FHIR standard, which describes a standardized data object in a JSON structure for medical information. Like if you had an radiology examination, the result of that radiology examination can now be standardized so that you get an exchangeable format that can be exchanged between one institute and the other institute. So it's all about interoperability. And in the FHIR standard, there is already a notion of the distinction between the patient and the person that agrees for a certain treatment. So if my parents are in a hospital, I can consent for a certain treatment on their behalf. And so these concepts are already part of FHIR. And that's why FHIR indeed looks at UMA for their implementation, even though that I didn't see a real life implementation of it.
And that FHIR standard is FHIR. That's what I was referring to. So thank you for stating me there. It's the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, very cleverly named.
Absolutely.
Is that privacy management something that you see being built into CIAM platforms more, or do you consider that still a separate kind of product? I guess, how do you see the market going in the future?
So I do see it as part of the IAM platforms, because for me, consent is all about managing access and authorizations. So the consent is, in fact, nothing else than an authorization decision. And we are now way too much focused on cookie consent or consent on my personal data. But if you look from a broader perspective, these are all specific use cases or of a more generic problem, which is give the user the ability to decide what data can be shared with whom. And if you look from that perspective to consent, it definitely fits in access management. And that's also why we include it in our platform as well as part of default features.
So let's talk a little bit about that authorization, because I think this kind of plays well nicely. We've got, concepts out there like RBAC or role-based access control. We've got ABAC, attribute-based access control. We've got PBAC, which is policy-based access control. And I'm sure there's plenty of other BACs out there of different letters or numbers. I think people probably are most familiar with role-based access control, especially on the enterprise side of the world, right? That's the concept of, I hired a accountant, and because I am an accountant, I get XYZ applications or accesses or whatever it may be. There's a growing trend to take more advantage of attribute-based access control, which seems to me like that might be a better fit on the consumer side of things, but could also be leveraged in an enterprise environment too. I guess from your perspective, how do you see those types of access control concepts playing specifically on the consumer side? Is there a place for role-based access control, or is it mostly access-based? And would something like policy-based access control play a role at some point?
Let's go back to the initial use cases when people started to define role-based access control as a standard, and this came up with that. And the idea of assigning roles to users is 100% linked with the position of a person in a company. So in a hierarchical structure of a company, where you've got a boss, where you've got departments, department units, managers, team managers, and the like. And based on the position of a person in that hierarchy, you get certain authorizations. And a way to build a model for that is to use roles as an abstraction layer. So applying this to the new way of working is already a big challenge, because even enterprises today do not have a clear hierarchy anymore. Certainly now with all the people working from home, the teleworking, and also the boost in independent co-workers or boutique firms that deliver certain services as a managed service. And so the enterprises of the company actually do no longer exist either. So my point of view, the position of RBAC, role-based access control, it comes nearly to an end. My point of view, it still has a certain need for the traditional ERP platforms that work in PPML swim lane type of workflows. But apart from that, the role is for me a subset of certain attributes. The role of a user is an attribute of that user. And so the next thing for me is indeed attribute-based access control, because there you can not only interpret the role of a user, but also combine the role with other attributes of that same user. Like, for instance, a certain certification that the user needs to have to access certain things.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, because I think we've seen historically a lot of organizations struggle with that role-based access control. It's complex. And, I tend to see the worst of what's out there, so not necessarily the best, but, it's hard. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. I am a fan of attribute-based access control, because I do think it separates logically the different parts of a persona and being able to, associate access based off of that that part of their persona. I'm in the Chicago area because I'm in Chicago. I get access to Chicago things, right? Because I'm in information security, I might get information security things. If I was in Atlanta, or Augusta with Jim, I might have Augusta location things. Or in Belgium, right? I'd have Belgium related things. Wouldn't change my relationship with information security. That's still the same. All it's changing is location. Why go through the effort of deconstructing the entire house and building a brand new one when you can just switch parts of the rooms of a house that's already built? I think it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of organizations would, benefit from that type of approach. And I can certainly see that on the consumer side too, right? Because you could be, a customer You could also be a vendor. You could also be an employee. We see this a lot in cases of like healthcare, education, those types of scenarios where, and I know you've done some teaching in the past as well, right? You could be a student and you could be a teacher and you could be a parent all at the same time. We had a conversation with Adam Michael a few weeks ago from Texas A&M University and kind of talked a little bit more there detail as well. Those different attributes about your persona really are what constructs your authorizations, right? So it seems to me like ABAC does have a natural fit in the consumer, at least a more natural fit on the consumer side. Am I accurate in that kind of thinking, or should I be looking at this a different way?
No, very much agree on that. Stepping back to the enterprise for 1 second, the role as an attribute still has a lot of value though, but it's only one of the attributes. And then going back to the consumer side, that's very often a misconception between between attribute-based access control and policy-based access control is that if you want to do it right in the consumer space, you do not only have to consider attributes that are linked to identity, but also attributes that are linked to resource or that are linked to the type of transaction that needs to take place, or maybe even contextual parameters like the time of the day. And so bridging ABAC to PBAC for me is all about using attributes that are not only linked to the identity. And then you build a platform that is scalable, where you can easily deal with 10 million consumers that all have very specific access needs.
That's interesting. So one of the thoughts I was having around authorization is the different roles in an authorization workflow, policy decision point, policy enforcement point, things like that. And I was wondering, there's kind of that lightweight integration of I have these apps, I want to bring them into a centralized authentication and authorization system. But essentially the authorization is that during the time of authentication, I'm just going to dump a bunch of attributes to the application. It's going to interpret those. And then to me, that's just leaving authorization in the application and externalizing the data. Really, I think where, that next step, that more mature way of doing authorization is where you centralize the policy decision. Even if you're not centralizing the policy enforcement, at least you're having the application come back and say, can I show the user this functionality, or, give me a yes, no decision rather than just dumping attributes to me. Is what I'm describing anything to do with, ABAC versus PBAC, or are those models something completely different?
No, what you describe is indeed a reference architecture which is documented in the ZACML reference in the ZACML standard XACML. So all good with that. Where I see people struggle is the desire to centralize too much, and so it's very hard if you really want to centralize all policy decisions in one central place. What I see as a more practical approach is that you have a sequence, a serial connection between different enforcement points, between different decision points that each take care of their realm of control, so their scope of control. Because even on the network level, you already have decision and enforcement. Like, is this a HTTPS request? Yes, okay, then I allow it. But this is not a decision that you would want to deal with in a centralized decision endpoint. So I'm a firm believer of different levels of granularity need different levels of decision-making logic. And so the coarse-grained authorizations can indeed be centralized in one spot, while fine-grained could be centralized somewhere else.
Is there a real-world example that you can kind of help me understand and wrap my head around this, that you can kind of point to and say, okay, here's how this style of authentication really kind of plays out step by step?
Let's take the hospital emergency room as an example. So it's the school example for policy-based access control. So whether a doctor can see patient record depends on the care relationship between the doctor and the patient. Unless that a patient enters the emergency room, then any doctor can basically access the patient record, because there's a need at that point in time to overrule the relationship between the patient and the doctor.
I have a quick follow up on the idea of coarse grained authentication or coarse grained authorization, because in my thinking of my early access management days, that was a commonly used term, and really what it boiled down to in most access management products at the time. So I'm thinking, SiteMinder, Oblix, the good old days. I'm thinking coarse grained authentication meant not only can you reach this website, but you can reach these sub URLs, or these URLs are blocked to you. So I'm wondering, I would think that's not still the modern approach. Now it's something more like, from an authorization perspective, you have these scopes or you don't have these scopes within the OAuth2 perspective.
And even one step deeper and a bit more granularity as well. What we do with Scaled Access is that we enrich OAuth access tokens with an authorization decision. So not only the scopes are determined by the policy decision endpoint, but also additional application-specific decisions that say this user is allowed in the next hour to do this and this and this. For instance, in media, the type of relationship that the user has with a subscription. So in the next hour, this user is allowed to modify the members of this shared subscription to this media channel. And so it's an authorization decision that is included as a specific attribute in the access tokens. And it goes further than the traditional URL-based Oblix style authorizations.
So we're just wondering, the fine grain point here, how do you achieve that time bounding of an authorization? Is it by timing out the authorization after 1 hour?
It's balancing security with performance. And so for a number of authorization decisions, you don't mind that there's an access token that is still valid for an hour and which basically bears an authorization decision, and where you have to wait until the token times out. But by using a token, you build very performant platforms with very low latency. While for other authorization decisions, you need a runtime decision. At this point in time, I want to do money transfer of 10,000 euros. Am I allowed to do this at this point in time, yes or no? And the second one requires a decision endpoint that can be embedded that can be addressed by the backend application to get an authorization decision instantly. And so what we very often do is combine both based on the types of authorization decision and basically balancing risk with performance.
That's kind of what I was thinking, is it's probably based on the individual authorization transaction, right? As to what type of time to live are you going to allow on the token? Is this, do you accept something that is more than X milliseconds or seconds old, right? Whatever the right framework is, or do you need that real time decision, right? Obviously, I think everyone wants more security. It's like, yeah, don't use an old token and let me do some sort of real time prompt to initiate a money transfer or whatever it may be. One of the things that I have heard is relationship-based access management. And since RBAC is already taken, maybe that's Reback, but might be a little bit too close to Reebok. What is relationship-based access management for folks that are out there listening?
It's an extension of attribute-based access control, where relationships between users or between users and objects are a key attribute in the decision. And so, similar to role being a key attribute in ABAC, relationship can also basically have the same connotation. And why relationships? Because it's a schema that we are all used to work with in the social networks. Everybody knows what a first line, second line, third line connection is in LinkedIn. We do not have to explain this. And if you use these concepts of giving people the ability to build an ecosystem, a network of relationships, and you can use these relationships to deduct what type of authorizations that user needs, then you've got relationship-based access control.
I think it's fascinating because I've seen this on the consumer side, especially when I think about things like Google Assistant and Siri and Alexa and these voice assistants, where you can tell it, who is your wife, your husband, your brother, right? And essentially you're filling out what I would imagine is, some sort of graph database in the background that says Jeff is related to somebody, right? And then maybe there's a decision point at some point that says, whatever that relationship looks like, do you allow that relationship to continue, or do you need a prompt on the other end? The LinkedIn example, for example, we get tons of LinkedIn requests, I'm sure, just like, we do. And, people always want to be your friend. It's like, okay, do I want to accept this connection? And that's how they let, non-paying LinkedIn people talk to each other, basically through messaging, yep. Right? Is that sort of the use case that you kind of envision for that relationship-based access management? Is there anything else that I'm missing?
No, absolutely these type of use cases. Huh? So the ease of use that we know from inviting somebody to your LinkedIn network, we should also be able to apply that, for instance, to a sales order or a shipment order in supply chain. Supply chain is a very difficult sector under stress these days. So they work a lot with independent drivers, truck drivers, and a lot of subcontractors from subcontractors. And so at the end, a human being needs to receive the shipment order. And the mechanism that people know from the social networks is indeed to invite somebody else to get access to the shipment order as well. And these are the type of use cases that we actually have built in our platform.
I'm thinking another use case for this is I have a new car. And for those wondering, it is a Volvo XC40 Recharge. Yes, I'm fully electric now for both my vehicles. And one of the things that you can do in both the Tesla vehicle as well as the Volvo vehicle is assign ownership of the vehicle to people. So essentially, you're laying a claim and saying, I have a relationship with my vehicle, right, that allows me to operate it remotely or whatever it may be. So I think that's probably another example of that sort of relationship-based access control.
Absolutely, and it's funny that you indeed mentioned Tesla, Volvo, and because these companies do have the budget and do have the means to build such a platform from scratch. But there's a pattern where different companies start building similar technologies. And as an entrepreneur, then I see an opportunity and say, this is something that needs to be platformized, and which is very similar to CIAM like a decade ago. Every retail brand did build their own CIAM solution. While today, 10 years later down the line, nobody still wants to build it themselves, but we all want to buy the best CIAM vendor in the market. And I think for authorizations and certainly for relationship-based access control, I see a similar evolution. It's not something that you want to build from scratch. It's something that you want to pick from a shelf that is tested, that has proven to be valid, and you want to configure it for your needs. And nothing more than that.
I was thinking with relationship-based access control, the way you described it, a use case of I'm working with a customer who's in the insurance industry. They sell policies through agents. Agents work for agencies. The insurance company has a contract with the agency to sell certain lines of products in certain states. The agencies hold the licenses. Well, they have the contract with the insurance company, and then they have certain, things they've been approved to sell within certain states. And then the agents also have licenses, right? So now you have these different parties. But I think the relationship there is now the agent authenticates, wants to use the system. They're a member of this agency. They can only sell the products that the agency has been contracted to sell. So there's kind of that complex relationship in kind of a real world example. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So if you start thinking about it, it can be very complex. If you think in a traditional relation-based databases, if you think in a graph database, it becomes a very easy problem to solve. And we do have customers in the insurance industry, so I do recognize the use cases that you mentioned, because at the end you've got users that can have multiple roles. So the employee of an agency is also insured, and can also have a car accident and needs to file a claim, but as an insured, as a beneficiary of an insurance. And so this is something which is very hard to manage traditionally. But if you put it in a graph database, it becomes something which is manageable because the graph database is by design built for recursivity. And so that single user can have different types of relationships with different entities.
Yeah, you think about with the examples we were talking about earlier, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, they're not built on SQL Server, right? They're
Definitely
these
not.
major graph databases. The Facebook graph is the one that I'm most familiar with. I mean, it's anybody who really wants to get in there and mess around, you can go out and it's publicly facing. All you need is a Facebook account and you can start exploring a little bit. But you built your product based on the graph database, and maybe you can just give us again that 101. What's the difference between the relational and the graph database, and why did you choose to build your product on graph?
So graph is designed to manage relationships. That's number one. If you would visualize it, it's like a cloud of an infinite number of very small data objects that are interconnected with an infinite number of relationships. And then you get a huge cloud of connected dots. And the interesting about such a cloud is that it actually can be managed in a very decentralized way, because each and every entry point in the cloud can be restricted in terms of access. So if I'm a user and my user is represented as a little object in the cloud and in that graph database, depending on the rules that determine what I can do, I can see, for instance, the n number of relationships in my graph database, which is what we are used to do with LinkedIn and Facebook. And so you have one cloud of relationships, but from a management point of view, since that you've got an infinite number of entry points in that cloud, you can delegate administration to these different subclouds, so to speak. And that's why we actually have chosen for a graph database to support our platform.
I would imagine if you're not careful, the performance may not be an improvement if you have so many pieces of individual data and you're having to parse through maybe an extreme number of relationship kind of scenarios. Is that a concern, or is it something that it's built to scale, it handles it pretty well, and as long as you don't get too crazy, right? And I'm thinking millions or billions of relationship things. I think even if you just think about a standard individual use case and just taking a person for an example, all the relationships that might exist could easily get into the millions, and then you parse that by the number of people might be an issue. Is that a concern, or how do you address that kind of problem?
The number of relationships is not that much of an issue. The performance issue comes from the size of the data objects that you want to store in the graph database. So a graph database is not meant to store a lot of data. So it's meant to hold identifiers, referentials, foreign keys to objects that live somewhere else. And so that's also what we use, how we work together with identity providers. So the user profile and the profile of a user is not something that we store in the graph database, because it's an object that lives in the master repository of all identities in the identity management platform. And we only use a referential, the UUID, to link that user to another user, which is also represented by the UUID. And since that we keep these objects very small in size, we gain in tremendous performance in querying an infinite number of relationships.
Gotcha. I think I understand then. So, I'll dumb it down for my own personal to see if this makes sense. But essentially, the graph database is kind of the glue that's basically holding all the relationships between those pieces of data. The data itself may not exist directly in the graph database, but the pointer to the data would at least be there to say, hey, here's how you make this inference or reference from one relationship to another.
That is correct. And so the data that we store in our graph database is the data that we need to make an authorization decision.
Well, that's very helpful for me. I know that you've been very generous with your time, and the sun is probably setting, if it hasn't already by this point in Belgium. I want to bring us up and start to swim to the surface. And one of the things I could do is kind of end a little bit on a lighter note here. Being from Belgium, here's my question for you as our resident Belgium expert. How about that? What is the best beer in Belgium that nobody knows about?
It's not a fair question because there are
Because
way
they're
too
all so
many.
good, right?
They're also good. They're also good. We've got way too many for them. Um, uh, one favorite I had it last week is Wolf, like the animal, and it's a beer that's brewed in Leuven, close to the office, and it's very very local, but it's a very nice beer.
Like a local microbrew type scenario.
Correct. And we've got plenty of those. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like microbrews have really kind of taken off. I think the world over. It seems like everybody's uncle is brewing something. In their kitchen.
And that's also the luxury of living in Belgium. So if you go and buy beer, you basically have to choose. And so by default, I've got like 5-6 different types of beer in my fridge because you pick and choose depending on the weather, time of the day, whatever. Yeah.
Right, there's a beer for every occasion. Is out
Absolutely.
There.
Yeah.
Jim, I think you've actually been to Belgium. What's something that you like?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about Belgium also that I love is that people will just sit down at a table outside a cafe and drink a Belgian beer and have a snack, some olives or some cheese, and that's just something that's just a way to spend the day and watch people, people watch, kind of like that's one of your favorite things to do, right, Jeff? I think you'd be very happy in Belgium doing that. So, I mean, you can't go wrong with Chimay. But I don't think that's one that people don't know about, right? I think that most people the world over know about Chimay. I going from memory here because it's been a little bit since I've had one. I think blue is my favorite. I think that's the best one. But I remember a brand called Le Chouffe. And so I was at a beer festival when I was in Brussels, and it's like of all weekends to land in for all I know, they happen every weekend, right? But I felt special that the weekend I was there, they're having this huge beer festival, and the Le Chouffe brewery was there, and I'm sure they had multiple varieties, but I remember the brand, and their logo is like a troll with a red troll hat, and they were giving these troll hats away, and I have a picture of myself and one of my buddies from work because we were on a work trip. It was paid. This is a free trip, by the way. Wearing this red hat, and I had more than a few beers in my system at that point.
I would pay to see you in a troll hat.
I'll send it to you if you promise not to post it on the internet.
I will absolutely not promise that at all. I'm not sure how popular it is outside of Belgium, or at least in Belgium, I should say. But I actually like something relatively simple called Hoegaarden. It's a wheat beer. I tend to like those styles better. But that's what I like. I don't know. Is Hoegaarden like Budweiser in Belgium, or is it at least a decent beer? Please, you can be kind or be brutal, whichever one you want.
No. It's definitely a decent beer. It's definitely also a beer with a certain character. Hoegaarden, they tried to move the brewery for about 20 kilometers, something like that, basically to optimize production, stuff like that. But after a while, actually, they moved brewery back to its original location, and the reason was that to brew the Weiss beer, you need a very specific yeast that actually lives in the air of the brewery. And even 20 kilometers away, they were not able to brew the same beer anymore. So it's beer with a certain character.
That's amazing. It's very similar to like the terroir, right, for wine, and where things are growing and the vines and things like that. I'm not much of a drinker. My wife is big into wine, so we have a pretty good collection. So I think that's probably the closest analogy that I would draw. But it's interesting to see. It's like, okay, yeah, 20-kilometer difference makes all the difference in the type of product. Who knows, right? Maybe that's a different version, better or worse. Sounds like it was not as good.
So it was not as good, indeed.
Good call on moving it back. All right. we've spent some quality time here with Ward. I really appreciate it. Before we wrap things up, I want to kind of pass it around the room for just kind of final thoughts. And Ward, we'll start with you. You've been very gracious with your time. We've been talking here, a lot about authentication and authorization when it comes to the consumer space, and even a little bit of privacy. What are some of the things that maybe people who are listening can take away from this conversation? Is like, all right, if I remember one thing, other than our beer selections, what is something they should take away from this conversation?
The A in CIAM stands for access. And I've got the impression that very often people forget about it. And in too much CIAM projects, people forget about the different levels of access that consumers need. And very often people consider each and every consumer kind of the same and give them the same type of access.
Interesting. Jim, how about yourself?
I did want to not go a full episode without mentioning our live streaming venture. Kind of been off to a little bit of a slow start, right? We've been getting episodes out there, so we're going to tinker with the format a little bit, maybe make it a little more focused on a single topic, but we're going to take a week off the week we're recording this, but we're going to get right back on it and, try to pick one topic a week, see how that goes. I mean, really, I would encourage folks, if you've been watching the recordings of it, if you can, join us during the live stream, because I think one thing we'd really like to do would be to field some live questions. So that can be found at idac.live. It'll bring you to our YouTube page, and we'll use LinkedIn to get the word out when we're going live. And if you can make it, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it would be cool to have people listening to the ravings of identity lunatics like you and I for more than 0 or 1 people. But yeah, it's that's how this started. So I'm not too concerned at this point. We'll do it as long as we're having fun with it, whether there's 0 people or 10,000 people watching, which would be amazing if you could get 10,000 people to watch anything identity related at the same time. But yeah, IDAC Live, we're on YouTube. Like Jim said, we'll take a break this week, but I think we've got 7 so far that are out on the channel. Leave comments, like it, tell us what you like, don't like, ping us on LinkedIn with ideas, things like that. We all take that into consideration. And, we want to put stuff out there that people are interested in. And the more people, the merrier. So I think with that's a great segue to take us out. IDAC.live, IDACpodcast.com, at IDAC podcast on Twitter. How do people get a hold of you, Ward, and Scaled Access? Should I have them go to your webpage at scaledaccess.com? How about LinkedIn?
LinkedIn or the website, that's all good.
Okay. I'll have links to both of those in our show notes that people can kind of check out. And, if you stop by, tell them we sent you, and that'll be helpful. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Appreciate your time, Ward. Thank you so much for joining us so late in your day. It was a great conversation, and Jim as well. Appreciate your time. And thanks for listening to the folks out there. We'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.